She didn't cry. Not when they tied her wrists. Not when they dragged her onto the platform in front of 300 strangers who laughed and pointed and called her plain. Cassandra Stone stood in the sweltering Georgia heat with her chin level and her jaw locked, and she made herself a promise, one she carved so deep into her chest that no auctioneer's voice could touch it. They could sell her hands. They could never sell what she carried inside them. Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1814 came in hard and mean, the way summers did in the low country of Georgia. Heavy with heat, thick with the smell of pine resin and red clay, and absolutely indifferent to the suffering of human beings. The town square of Millhaven had been dressed up for the occasion, if you could call it dressing up. Someone had hung a banner between two posts. The ink had already run in the humidity, and the letters sagged like they were ashamed of themselves. A crowd had gathered by 8 in the morning, most of them men in linen coats, with sweat rings under their arms, fanning themselves with their hats, and talking about cotton yields and road conditions, and who owed whom what. A few women stood at the edges with their parasols up, watching with expressions that tried very hard to look disinterested. On the wooden platform at the center of it all, they had lined up 6 people. Cassandra Stone was the last one on the right. She was 22 years old, and she was wearing a dress that had once been blue. It had been washed so many times it was closer to the color of old sky, that pale, washed-out gray blue that meant the day was almost over. Her dark hair had been pulled back severely, pinned at the nape of her neck so tightly it gave her a headache she'd had since before dawn. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rope. Not because she had fought them. She hadn't. They'd tied her anyway. The man running the auction was named Gilroy Stubbs. He had small eyes and a large voice, and he used that voice the way some men use a whip. Not because it was necessary, but because they enjoyed the sound of it. "Next up," Stubbs called out, strolling down the line until he stopped in front of Cassandra. "We got ourselves a fine example of a domestic worker. Young, healthy, no known defects." He grabbed her chin without warning and turned her face left, then right, the way a man examines a horse's teeth. "Been working house service since she was 14. Obedient. Quiet." He said quiet like it was her best quality. Cassandra did not move. She fixed her eyes on a point just past the crowd, a water oak at the far end of the square, its branches hanging low and still in the dead air, and she breathed. "Starting bid, $8, Stubbs announced. The crowd stirred. Someone snorted. $8 for that?" a man near the front said, loudly enough to be sure everyone heard him. "She ain't much to look at." A few people laughed. Cassandra's jaw tightened. The water oak. She kept her eyes on the water oak. $8, Stubbs said again. "Somebody start me off. She's strong. She keeps her mouth shut. And she won't cost you half what the others will in upkeep." "6, a voice called from the left side of the crowd. "Sir, we're starting at 8. "Then I ain't interested." More laughter. Stubbs looked irritated. He turned back to Cassandra, like her lack of bidding activity was somehow her fault. "Smile," he muttered, low enough that only she could hear. "Make yourself look useful." Cassandra looked at him for the first time since she'd been brought up onto the platform. She didn't smile. Something in her expression made Stubbs take a small, unconscious step back. He covered it quickly, turning back to the crowd with his big voice rolling out again. $8, ladies and gentlemen, a fine domestic servant. Somebody start me off at 8. 10. The voice came from the back of the crowd, and it landed differently than the other voices. It wasn't loud, exactly. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a voice that was accustomed to being heard, the kind of quiet authority that came not from aggression, but from certainty. The certainty that when it spoke, the room adjusted. The crowd shifted. People turned. At the back edge of the square, a man stood slightly apart from the rest. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work, despite his obvious wealth. Broad across the shoulders, straight-backed, unhurried in every movement. He was wearing a coat the color of charcoal, despite the heat, and he hadn't bothered to remove his hat. He had a ledger tucked under one arm. His name was Jonathan Monroe. Duke Jonathan Monroe, if you were being formal about it, though the title was American in the loosest sense, inherited from a grandfather who'd had grand ambitions about what the new republic would become, and had given his family a designation to match. Most people in Millhaven simply called him Mr. Monroe, or Sir, or nothing at all, because they found it easier not to engage with him than to figure out how. He was looking at Cassandra, not the way the other men had been looking at her, the appraising, dismissive inventory of someone assessing livestock. He was looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't quite fit where it's been placed. $10, he said again, when no one else moved. Stubbs blinked. Mr. Monroe, didn't expect to see you here today, sir. 12, called another voice, a heavier man toward the middle of the crowd, red-faced in the heat, someone Cassandra didn't recognize. Jonathan Monroe glanced briefly toward the sound of the competing voice. 15, he said. Silence. The red-faced man opened his mouth, then closed it again. $15, Stubbs said, and something in his voice had shifted. A careful deference that hadn't been there before. Do I hear 16? 15 going once. 15 going twice. Sold, Monroe said, before Stubbs even finished, and he was already moving forward through the crowd. Cassandra had been in enough bad situations to know when she was moving from one kind of trouble into another. She watched Jonathan Monroe approach the platform with the same stillness she'd held all morning, but inside, she was cataloging everything. The way he moved, no wasted motion, no performance. The ledger under his arm, which meant he'd come here with a specific purpose, and this had been part of it, not an impulse. The way the crowd parted for him without him asking. He stopped at the base of the steps. He didn't come up onto the platform. He stood there and looked up at her, and up close his eyes were dark brown and completely unreadable. Come down, please, he said. Not get down, not move. Please. Cassandra stepped down from the platform. Her bound wrists made the step awkward, and she stumbled slightly on the last one. Not badly, not enough to fall, but enough to catch. Monroe's hand came up instinctively, steadied her elbow for exactly the half-second it took to confirm she had her footing, then withdrew. No comment, no look, like the gesture had been reflex rather than intention. Stubbs had scurried over with the paperwork. Monroe took the pen from him, signed without reading, which told Cassandra he already knew the terms, and handed it back. Then he looked at her wrists. Did you need those? He asked Stubbs. Standard procedure, sir. I'm asking if you needed them. His voice was still even, still quiet. Stubbs fumbled for a moment, then produced a small knife and cut the rope. The blood coming back into Cassandra's wrists stung. She didn't let it show. She rubbed one wrist slowly against the other and waited. Monroe looked at her for a moment, then looked away, back toward the edge of the square, where a man was waiting with 2 horses. My name is Jonathan Monroe, he said, as if introducing himself to someone he'd encountered at a dinner party. I own Harrowfield 12 miles east of here. You'll be working in the main house." He paused. "Do you have belongings?" Cassandra stared at him. "No," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "No, sir." "Then we'll leave now." He started walking toward the horses without looking back to see if she followed. She followed. What else was there to do? Behind her, she could hear the crowd already moving on to the next person on the platform, the voices rising again, Stubbs launching into his performance once more. The sounds fell away as she walked. She did not look back. The ride to Harrowfield was 12 miles, and mostly silent. Monroe rode slightly ahead, which gave Cassandra time to think without the pressure of being observed. Or so she believed, until she caught him glancing back at her twice in the first mile alone, each time so briefly and so expressionlessly that she might have imagined it. She hadn't imagined it. She kept her posture straight and her face neutral. She had learned how to make herself into still water, reflective surface, nothing below. She'd been practicing it for 8 years, since the night everything in her life had collapsed into rubble, and she'd understood, with a clarity that felt less like wisdom than like cold water thrown into her face, that survival required a kind of performance. You showed the world exactly what it expected to see. Nothing more. Nothing more. The road cut through thick summer forest, the air dense with heat and the buzzing of insects and the occasional sound of a distant creek. About 4 miles out, Monroe slowed his horse until he was riding beside her rather than ahead. He didn't say anything immediately, just rode. Then, "How long were you in service before today?" Cassandra glanced at him. 8 years. Where? Different households. She kept her answer flat, informative but not inviting. What kinds of work? House management, kitchen, records when they needed someone who could read. Monroe looked at her then, a quick, direct look. You can read? Yes, sir. He turned back to the road. Most of the men at that auction today would have considered that a liability. I know, Cassandra said. A beat. Is that why you bought me? She asked. The question came out before she'd fully decided to ask it, which was unlike her. She'd trained herself out of that kind of instinct. But something about the way he'd asked his questions, practical and direct, without the usual performance of authority that men in his position affected, had thrown her slightly off her careful rhythm. Monroe didn't seem offended by the question. Partly, he said. Harrowfield keeps substantial records. My previous house manager left suddenly 3 weeks ago. I have 2 crates of correspondence and account books that no one has touched since. He paused. Also, Reginald Hurst was about to outbid me. The man in the crowd? Yes. You don't like him? I don't trust him, Monroe corrected, and there was a distinction in the way he said it, like the difference mattered to him. He's been trying to acquire workers with particular skill sets for the past 6 months. I prefer not to let him. Cassandra absorbed this. She filed it carefully away, the way she filed everything, not yet understanding the shape of it, but knowing she would need it later. That seems like an expensive reason, she said. Monroe's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one. It was $12 more than I intended to spend this morning, he agreed, and rode on. Harrowfield was not what she'd expected. She hadn't let herself expect anything. Expectation was a luxury she'd learned to refuse. But she'd built certain assumptions based on what she knew of men like Jonathan Monroe, and those assumptions had included a particular kind of grandeur, the showy, aggressive grandeur of new money trying to look like old money. Harrowfield was none of that. It was large. It was well kept. But there was something about it that suggested function over performance. A working house, not a display house. The grounds were tended, but not manicured into artificiality. The main building was wide rather than tall, built for practicality in the Georgia heat, with deep porches on all sides that would hold shade even in the worst of August. A woman came out to meet them as they rode in. Mid-50s, compact and efficient in her movements, with gray streaking through her dark hair and an expression that evaluated Cassandra in approximately 3 seconds. "Mrs. Hale," Monroe said, dismounting. "This is—" He paused and looked at Cassandra. "Cassandra," she said. "Stone." He nodded. "Cassandra Stone. She'll be handling records and correspondence, and assisting with whatever else the house needs." Mrs. Hale looked at Cassandra for another moment. Then she said, "Can you manage a household ledger?" "Yes, ma'am." "Have you dealt with account disputes?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you can read a contract?" Cassandra met the woman's eyes directly. "I can read a contract, identify discrepancies in a supply invoice, and draft formal correspondence." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then she said to Monroe, "Where did you find her?" "Millhaven," he said, and handed his reins to a waiting stable hand without elaborating. Mrs. Hale looked back at Cassandra with an expression that was harder to read now, less like evaluation and more like recognition of something she hadn't expected to find. "All right," the older woman said. "Come with me." The crates of correspondence were worse than Cassandra had been told. She found them in a small room off the main hall that Monroe apparently used as a study. 2 wooden crates stacked in the corner. A desk covered in loose papers that had been disturbed but not organized. And a window that faced east, which meant the afternoon sun wouldn't turn the room into an oven. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the disorder. Then she sat down, pushed up her sleeves, and began. She sorted by date first, then by sender, then by type: correspondence, invoices, legal documents, personal letters that had been misfiled with official communications. The previous house manager had been either careless or overwhelmed, possibly both. Several invoices appeared twice, which usually meant they'd been paid twice, which meant someone had either made a serious error or was helping themselves to a portion of Harrowfield's accounts. She was 3 hours into the work when she heard footsteps stop in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn around. She already knew by the weight of the step. "You've organized them," Monroe said. "I found 3 duplicate invoices," Cassandra said, not stopping, "from the same supplier. 2 of them have been paid. The third hasn't. It's dated 6 weeks ago, which is approximately when your previous house manager left." Silence. "The amounts match too precisely to be coincidence," she continued. "The same items, the same quantities, same pricing. Someone was billing you twice and pocketing the difference." She heard Monroe step into the room. She heard him pick up one of the invoices she had set to the side in a separate group. "How much?" he asked. "Close to $40 over the past year, based on what I can trace in 3 hours. There's likely more." He set the invoice down. "How did you know to look for that?" he asked. Now Cassandra did stop. She turned and looked at him. This man who had bought her 12 hours ago for $15, who had cut the rope from her wrists and introduced himself like a reasonable human being, who was looking at her now, not with suspicion, but with something that was far more dangerous and far harder to deflect. He was looking at her like she was worth understanding. "Because," she said carefully, "I have managed enough households to know that when a house manager leaves suddenly, it is almost never because of circumstances beyond their control." Monroe held her gaze. "And the rest?" "The rest," Cassandra said, turning back to the desk, "I'll have for you by tomorrow morning." That night, in the small room off the kitchen that Mrs. Hale had prepared for her, Cassandra sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let herself, for just a moment, stop performing. The house was quiet. The night insects had started up outside the window, filling the darkness with their rhythmic noise. The room was plain but clean. A bed, a small table, a chair, a washstand with a ceramic basin, more than she'd had in some places, less than she'd had in others. She reached under the collar of her dress and touched the things she had not thought about all day because she could not afford to think about it. The things she had spent 8 years training herself to forget and failing every single night when the world went quiet and there was nothing left to manage and nothing left to perform, and she was only herself. Beneath her left shoulder blade, so far back that she could only touch it with difficulty, there was a mark. It had been there since birth. Her mother had told her once what it meant, had told her carefully and quietly, and with a fear in her eyes that Cassandra had not understood then and understood entirely now. Had told her that this mark was why they had to be careful. This mark was why they had to stay hidden. This mark was why, if anyone ever found out who they really were, everything would break open. Her mother had been right. Everything had broken open anyway. Cassandra let her hand fall. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the insects and breathed. 12 miles east of Millhaven, a house full of records, a man who had looked at her like she was worth understanding. She hadn't been placed here by accident. She had never believed in accidents, not since she was old enough to understand that the forces that had dismantled her family were patient and deliberate and very, very thorough. Someone knew where she was. They had always known. The question was whether Jonathan Monroe was one of them, or whether, in this slow and complicated summer, he was something she had never once allowed herself to count on. Someone who was not. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. Outside, the Georgia night pressed in on all sides, hot and full of noise, indifferent as ever. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the fields of Harrowfield, something was already moving toward her. Patient, deliberate, and very, very thorough. It always was. She had the rest of the accounts finished before sunrise, not because she couldn't sleep, though that was also true, but because the work steadied her in a way that nothing else did. Numbers didn't lie. They bent sometimes in the hands of people who knew how to bend them, but they always left a trail. And Cassandra had spent enough years following trails to know that you never stopped at the first one you found. By the time the house began to wake around her, the sounds of the kitchen stirring, water being drawn, footsteps crossing the floor above, she had identified not 3 duplicate invoices, but 7. She had also found something else, something that sat in the pit of her stomach like a stone pulled from a cold creek. The property survey records for Harrowfield were wrong. Not incorrectly recorded, deliberately altered. The boundary lines on the survey filed 6 months ago did not match the boundary lines on the original deed, which she had found folded inside a leather portfolio at the bottom of the second crate. Someone had shaved 40 acres off the eastern edge of the property on paper, while leaving the physical fences exactly where they had always been, which meant someone was preparing to dispute those acres legally, with a falsified survey as their evidence. She sat with that knowledge for a long moment. Then she heard footsteps in the hall. Unhurried, deliberate, and she knew without turning who they belonged to. Monroe stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the desk, which was now entirely organized, the papers sorted into clean stacks with small labels she'd made from torn strips of brown paper. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I found something," she said. She told him about the survey. She watched his face as she explained it, watched the stillness in it, the way he absorbed information without performing a reaction, just taking it in and turning it over behind his eyes. Most men, when told something that threatened what they owned, went one of 2 ways immediately: fury or denial. Monroe did neither. He picked up the original deed. He picked up the altered survey. He set them side by side on the desk and stood there reading both documents. And he was quiet for so long that the kitchen sounds from down the hall seemed very loud. "Reginald Hurst," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "The boundary change favors whoever holds the eastern parcel," Cassandra said. "I don't know who that is." "Hurst acquired it 14 months ago." Monroe set the papers down. "Through a transaction that I thought at the time was opportunistic, but legal." He paused. "It wasn't opportunistic." "No," she said. "It was the first step." He looked at her. "Whoever planned this didn't start last week," she said. "The duplicate invoices go back over a year. The house manager, whoever left, was either compromised or replaced by someone who was already working for Hurst. The survey was filed 6 months ago. This has been building for a long time." She held his gaze. "Long enough that I'd want to know whether any of the other staff have connections to Hurst's household." Monroe was very still. "That," he said quietly, "is not the kind of analysis I expected from a domestic worker purchased at auction yesterday morning." The room contracted. Cassandra felt it, the sudden sharpening of the air between them, the moment where she'd gone one sentence too far, revealed one edge too many of what she actually was. She made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. "My father was a solicitor," she said. The lie was close enough to the truth that it sat naturally in her mouth. "Before everything fell apart, I spent years watching him work. Some of it stuck." Monroe studied her. "What fell apart?" "Everything," she said simply, and turned back to the desk. "The survey needs to be taken to a land office before Hurst files a legal challenge. I'd do it within the week." A long beat. "All right," Monroe said, and she heard him straighten, heard the small shift of his coat. "I'll leave this afternoon." "You should take both documents," she said, "and make a copy of each before you go." "Can you make those copies?" She looked up at him. "Yes, sir." "Then do it," he said. And he stopped, started again. "Miss Stone." "Sir?" "The work you've done this morning." He paused, and she could tell he was a man who chose his words with the same deliberateness he chose everything else. "It was more than I hired you for." "You hired me to manage your records," she said. "This is your records." He nodded once, slow. Then he left. Cassandra let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hands, when she looked down at them, were perfectly steady. She'd always been grateful for that her hands didn't betray her even when everything else wanted to. She reached for a clean sheet of paper and began making the copies. Monroe was gone by early afternoon, and the house settled into a different rhythm in his absence. Quieter, looser. The way a room relaxes when the most significant presence in it walks out. Mrs. Hale found her in the study an hour later. "You're still in here," the older woman said, not quite a question. "There's more to go through." Mrs. Hale stepped inside and looked at the organized desk with the same expression she'd worn yesterday. That complicated, hard-to-read look that sat somewhere between wariness and grudging respect. She was carrying a tray with food on it, which she set down on the corner of the desk without comment. "He doesn't usually talk to the new help," Mrs. Hale said. Cassandra didn't look up from the invoice she was reading. "Is that so? Not like that." The older woman pulled the chair from the corner and sat in it like she'd made a decision. "I've been at Harrowfield 11 years. I've seen him hire a dozen people, and I've watched him have exactly the same conversation with all of them. What you do, what's expected, here's your room. That's it. That's the whole conversation." "He asked me questions on the road," Cassandra said. "I know. I was watching from the porch when you rode in." Mrs. Hale folded her hands in her lap. "He rode beside you." Cassandra set the invoice down and looked at Mrs. Hale directly. "What are you telling me?" I'm not telling you anything, the older woman said carefully. I'm observing. There's a difference. She paused. I'm also going to observe that this house has had some trouble lately, and that trouble has a name, and I want to know whether you rode in with that trouble or whether you're something else entirely. The kitchen sounds had stopped. The house was very quiet. I was purchased at a public auction yesterday morning, Cassandra said, for $15 by a man who, as far as I can tell, bought me partly to prevent someone else from doing the same. She kept her voice even. If I'm part of the trouble at Harrowfield, I wasn't consulted about it. Mrs. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Your hands are ink-stained up to the second knuckle, the older woman said finally. You write like someone who's been doing it their whole life, not like someone who picked it up watching their father work. She stood and straightened her dress. I'm not your enemy, girl, but I've been keeping this house safe for 11 years, and I intend to keep doing it. She nodded toward the tray. Eat something. You've been in here since before dawn. She left without waiting for a response. Cassandra sat with that for a moment. Then she ate. 3 days passed. Monroe came back on the fourth morning with a look on his face that Cassandra read immediately. The controlled, flat-eyed expression of a man who had received exactly the news he was afraid of receiving and was not yet ready to discuss it. She gave him until noon. At noon, she knocked on the study door, which was closed. It had been closed since he'd returned, and waited. Come in. He was standing at the window with his back to the door. On the desk behind him was a document she hadn't seen before, stamped with an official seal. The land office, he said, without turning, received a legal challenge to the eastern boundary of Harrowfield's deed 6 days ago. Cassandra closed the door behind her. Filed by Hearst's solicitor, Monroe continued, before I arrived, before I even knew the survey had been altered. He finally turned, which means he expected me not to know. He expected that without a house manager, the discrepancy would sit in a crate unread for weeks, possibly months, until he'd already filed and the challenge was recorded, she said. At which point, even with the original deed, the dispute becomes a legal process, which takes time, which costs money. His voice was level, but there was something hard underneath it, not rage, which would have been easier to manage, but the colder, more dangerous thing that lived below rage in men who were very controlled. It would have worked. He looked at her. If you hadn't found it, he said, it would have worked. Cassandra moved to the desk and looked at the document. Has a date been set for the challenge hearing? 4 weeks. Then we have 4 weeks to build a counter-argument. She looked up. Do you have a solicitor? In Savannah. But Hearst's man is better. He's been working Georgia land disputes for 20 years, and he wins more than he loses. Then we don't argue the boundary on its own, Cassandra said. We argue the fraud, the duplicate invoices, the false survey, the timing of your house manager's departure. We present it not as a property dispute, but as a coordinated scheme to defraud, which is what it is. She picked up the challenge document. Who stamped this? Associate Land Registrar by the name of Cobb. Does Cobb have any financial relationship with Hearst? Monroe stared at her. I'm asking, she said patiently, because if the registrar who accepted the challenge also has a business connection to the man filing it, that is its own kind of argument. Monroe sat down slowly in the chair behind the desk. He looked at her with that expression she was becoming familiar with, the one that was not quite readable, the one that happened when she said something he hadn't expected, and he was deciding what to do with the fact that she'd said it. You think like a lawyer, he said. I think like someone who has watched powerful people use paperwork to take things from people who can't fight back, she said quietly. It's a different kind of education. A long silence. Cobb's brother-in-law manages Hearst's grain supply, Monroe said. It's known in Millhaven. No one considers it relevant because the two businesses appear separate. They're not separate, Cassandra said. They're a chain. She set the document down. Write to your solicitor today. Tell him to look at Cobb first and the survey second. And tell him we'll need everything he can find on the relationship between Hurst's household and your previous house manager. Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. He didn't ask how she knew to think this way. He didn't ask where any of this came from. He simply began to write. And something about that, the uncomplicated acceptance of what she'd given him, the absence of the performance of suspicion that she'd braced for, made something in Cassandra's chest shift in a way she didn't have a name for, and wasn't sure she wanted one. She turned to leave. "Miss Stone." She stopped. "The man who sold you at auction," Monroe said, without looking up from his letter. "Stubbs. He said you'd been in service since you were 14. "That's what he said," she replied. "Before that?" A breath. "My family fell on hard times." "You said your father was a solicitor." "He was." Monroe set down his pen. He looked up. "What happened to him?" Cassandra kept her face still. She had answered 100 questions in 100 difficult rooms, and she had always known which answer to give and when to give it. This was a room where the wrong answer could undo everything she had worked 8 years to survive. "He died," she said. "When I was 14, debts followed. The rest is the rest." She met his eyes steadily. "Is there anything else you need for the letter?" Monroe looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "No, thank you." She left the room. In the hallway, she stood for exactly 3 seconds with her eyes closed and her back against the wall, and let herself feel the things she couldn't feel inside that room. The old, cold fear that lived permanently in the space between her ribs. The fear that one day someone would ask the exact right question, in the exact right order, and she would run out of room to maneuver. 3 seconds. Then she straightened, opened her eyes, and walked back toward the study to continue working. It was Mrs. Hale who noticed first. Not the way Monroe had been noticing. That careful, measured attention that he kept wrapped tight and mostly out of sight. Mrs. Hale noticed the way women who have managed houses for a long time notice things. Not by looking directly, but by watching the edges. She found Cassandra in the laundry yard on a Thursday, hanging sheets in the thick afternoon heat. And she stood there for a moment before she spoke. "You're favoring your left side," Mrs. Hale said. Cassandra didn't stop. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. I said you were favoring your left side." The older woman stepped closer. "How long has your back been hurting you?" "It's not, girl." Mrs. Hale's voice was quiet, but it had iron in it. "I raised 3 children and managed this household through 2 illnesses and a flood. I know what it looks like when someone is pretending to be fine. How long?" Cassandra hung the last sheet and turned around. She held Mrs. Hale's gaze. "It isn't pain," she said carefully. There's something on my back. A mark. Sometimes when the heat gets into it, it aches." Mrs. Hale's expression didn't change. "Show me." "Ma'am?" "Cassandra." The older woman's voice dropped lower. "I have seen things in 11 years at this house that most people haven't seen in a lifetime. Show me." Something in the way she said it, the particular weight of it, the certainty that came not from nosiness but from knowledge, from the sense that she already knew something and needed only the confirmation, made Cassandra go very still. She looked at Mrs. Hale for a long moment. Then she reached back, pulling aside the fabric at her shoulder, tilting so the older woman could see the mark beneath her left shoulder blade. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. Mrs. Hale knew what she was looking at. Cassandra could see it in the way the blood drained from the woman's face. Not in shock, but in recognition. In the way her hands, which had been folded in front of her, slowly came apart. "God Almighty," Mrs. Hale whispered. "You've seen it before," Cassandra said. It was not a question. The older woman looked up from the mark. Her eyes were different now, stripped of the watchful evaluation, the careful management. What was underneath was something older and rawer and considerably more frightened. "Your mother," Mrs. Hale said. "What was her name?" Cassandra's heart stopped. "Where did you hear about my mother?" she said softly. Mrs. Hale's mouth was working without sound for a moment. Then she said, "Because I knew her. 20 years ago. Before all of it." She pressed her hand against her mouth briefly, then lowered it. "She told me if I ever saw that mark again on a young woman, I was to protect her with everything I had and ask questions second." The laundry yard was absolutely still. Cassandra felt the ground shift beneath her, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. 8 years of controlled, deliberate, careful survival, and now a woman she'd known for 4 days was standing in front of her with her mother's instructions in her mouth. And everything Cassandra had built to keep herself hidden was cracking open from an angle she'd never in her life considered. "She's dead," Cassandra said. Her voice was very quiet. "My mother. She's been dead for 6 years." "I know," Mrs. Hale said. The older woman's eyes were bright now, not with tears exactly, but with the pressure of something that had been held back for a very long time. "I heard. I have been watching for you for 3 years, Cassandra. 3 years." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed it back together with visible effort. "How in God's name did you end up on an auction block in Millhaven?" Cassandra looked at her. Then she looked at the sheets on the line, at the afternoon light cutting across the laundry yard, at the ordinary world continuing to turn around them. "The same way everything happened," she said quietly. "Someone made sure of it. And somewhere behind the main house, deep in the eastern fields, that someone had spent 14 months trying to steal. Something moved in the tree line. Not wind, not animal, but the deliberate and patient movement of a person who had been waiting, and who now knew, with absolute certainty, exactly where she was." Mrs. Hale grabbed her arm before she could take a single step toward the tree line. "Don't," the older woman said, low and sharp. "Don't look directly. Don't move fast. Just turn around and walk back inside with me like nothing happened." Cassandra's every instinct screamed against it. Every muscle in her body was already calculating distance, angle, whether she could reach the fence before whoever was in that tree line reached her. 8 years of running had trained her to move first and think second, and right now, every nerve she had was lit up like a pine log in dry season. But she listened. She turned around. She walked back toward the house with Mrs. Hale's hand firm on her elbow. And she kept her breathing even and her pace steady. And she did not look back. The moment the kitchen door closed behind them, Mrs. Hale shot the bolt. "How long has someone been watching this property?" Cassandra asked. "I don't know that someone has been." The older woman moved to the window, standing to the side of it, looking out at an angle. "I don't know that what I saw was a person." "You bolted the door." Mrs. Hale was quiet for a beat. "I bolted the door," she admitted. Cassandra moved to stand beside her, mirroring the angle, looking out the same way. The tree line was still. Whatever had been there, whoever, was gone, or was very good at being still, which was almost worse. "You need to tell me everything," Cassandra said. "Right now. Not the careful version. Not the version you've been deciding how to give me since you saw the mark. All of it." Mrs. Hale turned from the window. She looked at Cassandra for a long moment. Not the evaluating look she'd worn those first days, but something more exhausted, more resolved, like a woman who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had finally arrived at the place where she was supposed to put it down. "Sit down," she said. "I'd rather stand." "Cassandra, sit down." She sat. Mrs. Hale sat across from her and folded her hands on the table and began. "Your mother's name was Eleanor Voss before she married your father. Her family held land in the Carolinas going back 4 generations. Not just land, but a charter. An original colonial charter that carried specific legal protections for the territory it covered. Mineral rights, water rights, governance rights over 3 counties that have since become considerably more valuable than anyone anticipated when the charter was originally granted." She paused. "Your grandfather had 2 children, your mother and a son. Your uncle, a man named Gerald Voss." Cassandra's hands were flat on the table. She made herself keep them flat. "Gerald Voss," she said. "I know that name." "You should. He's the reason your family is gone." Mrs. Hale's voice was entirely steady, which was its own kind of courage. "He disputed the inheritance when your grandfather died. He claimed the charter had passed to him, not your mother, on the grounds that a woman couldn't legally hold a colonial charter under the original terms. The courts agreed. Your mother and your father fought it for years. They lost every time." "My father didn't die of debt," Cassandra said quietly. It wasn't a question anymore. "No," Mrs. Hale said. "He didn't." The kitchen was very still. "Gerald Voss," Cassandra said again, and this time the name tasted like what it was, like the shape of a thing that had been chasing her since she was 14 years old. Formless and enormous, and always just behind her. And now, finally, it had a face. "He's been looking for you since your mother died," Mrs. Hale said. "Because the charter has a provision, old language, almost never enforced, but legally intact. If the original holder dies with a living direct descendant who can produce proof of bloodline, the charter can be challenged. Reopened." She looked at Cassandra directly. "The mark on your shoulder is in the charter, described exactly. It was your grandmother's, and her mother's before her, and your grandfather had it written into the document as a bloodline identifier because he didn't trust paper records alone." The room tilted. Cassandra put both hands flat on the table and breathed. "The charter covers the territory," she said slowly, working through it. "And the territory includes the eastern counties, yes." Mrs. Hale's voice was very careful now. "Including the parcel that Reginald Hurst purchased 14 months ago. Including the land he's been trying to acquire through the false survey." A beat. "Hurst isn't working alone, Cassandra. He's working for your uncle." There it was, the whole shape of it, finally visible. The false survey, the corrupted house manager, the duplicate invoices. Hurst acquiring the parcel. It hadn't been about Harrowfield at all. It had been about the land beneath Harrowfield. About clearing the way for a legal claim that could only be challenged by one person in the world. And someone had put that person on an auction block in Millhaven, where she could be quietly acquired and quietly disappeared. "Who was supposed to buy me?" Cassandra asked. Her voice was flat and precise. Mrs. Hale closed her eyes briefly. "Hurst." The word hit the room like a stone hitting water. Small sound, enormous rings. "Monroe outbid him," Cassandra said. "Yes." "Monroe didn't know what he was outbidding." "No, he just didn't want Hurst to have you. He told me that night. Said he didn't know why specifically, that something about the situation felt wrong." Mrs. Hale opened her eyes. "Jonathan Monroe is the most difficult man to read that I have ever met in my life. But in 11 years I have never once seen him do something without a reason, even when he couldn't name the reason yet." Cassandra stood up from the table. She needed to move. She needed to think, and she thought better when she was moving, when her body had something to do so her mind could work without the noise of stillness pressing in on all sides. She paced to the window, back, to the door, back. "Does Monroe know any of this?" she asked. "No." "Does he know about the charter?" "I don't believe so. The Voss Charter is old history in the Carolinas. Most people who knew about it when it mattered are dead or gone." "Hearst knows." "Hearst knows. And Gerald Voss knows. And now," Mrs. Hale looked at her steadily, "someone in that tree line knows you're here." Cassandra stopped pacing. "I have to tell Monroe," she said. "Yes," Mrs. Hale said simply. "You do." She found him in the stables. He was checking the shoe of his bay horse himself, rather than leaving it to the stable hand, which she had come to understand was simply how he was, a man who did not delegate the things he could do himself, not out of distrust, but out of habit. He heard her come in and looked up, and something in her face made him set the horse's foot down immediately and straighten. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a recognition. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to think about it." He looked at her for a moment. "All right. It's going to change what you think about why I'm here." "All right. It might change what you think about your own property." He was very still. "Tell me." So she told him. She told him about Eleanor Voss and the charter and Gerald and the inheritance dispute. She told him about her father, not the lie she'd given him in the study, but the truth, or as much of the truth as she had confirmed over 8 years of piecing it together in stolen moments in other people's houses. She told him about the mark and what it meant, and why her mother had been afraid of it, and why her mother had been right to be afraid. She told him about Hearst and what Mrs. Hale had told her, and she watched his face the whole time, because she needed to read it, needed to know, the moment it shifted, whether she was about to become a problem he was going to solve in the way that powerful men solved inconvenient problems. His face didn't shift. It settled, harder, more concentrated, the way a man looks when the puzzle he's been working finally produces the picture. When she finished, the stable was quiet except for the horses moving softly in their stalls. "Show me," Monroe said. Cassandra went still. "Sir." "The mark." His voice was entirely level. "Not because I don't believe you, because if we're going to use it as legal evidence, I need to know exactly what we're working with." She hadn't expected that framing. She turned, pulled the back of her collar aside, tilted her shoulder toward him. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. "It's exactly as Mrs. Hale described it," Monroe said quietly. Cassandra straightened and turned back around. "You already spoke to her?" "She came to find me 10 minutes ago. Said you needed to talk to me, and that I should hear you out without interrupting." A very slight pause. "She also said that if I reacted badly, she would personally make my life considerably more difficult." Despite everything, despite the tree line and Gerald Voss and the shape of the trap she was standing in the middle of, Cassandra felt something almost like a laugh move through her chest. She pressed it down. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About which part?" "Any of it." Monroe looked at her steadily. "Hearst files his legal challenge in 4 weeks, which means we have 4 weeks to build a counter-argument, discredit his survey, expose his connection to your uncle, and present you and the charter as the actual legal issue underlying what he's calling a property dispute." He picked up the horse's foot again, examined it, set it down. "It's a considerable amount of work." "Yes," she said, "it is." "You've been doing this kind of work for 8 years on your own." "Yes." He looked up at her. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." The words were simple, He said them the way he said most things, without decoration, without performance, just plainly. And maybe that was why they landed the way they did. Not gently, but hard, like something that had been aimed carefully at exactly the place in her chest that 8 years of solitary survival had worn thin. She held his gaze. "Mr. Monroe," she said carefully, "you understand what you're involving yourself in. Gerald Voss has resources and connections and a 20-year head start on this fight. Hearst has already compromised your house and your land records. There is someone watching your property right now from the eastern tree line. If you help me, you become a target in a way you currently are not." "I'm already a target," Monroe said. "The false survey made sure of that." He picked up a brush from the shelf and ran it along the horse's flank with the same methodical calm he brought to everything. "The only thing that changes, if I help you, is whether I understand the reason." Cassandra stared at him. He glanced back at her, and there was something in his eyes now. Not warmth exactly. Not yet. But the precursor to it. The ground that warmth grew from. Which was recognition. The sense of one person seeing another person clearly, without flinching, without the management and performance of it. "You could have told Stubbs who you were at the auction," he said. "Someone would have paid attention. Someone would have investigated." "Someone would have put me somewhere I couldn't leave," she said quietly. "The same way they put my brother somewhere he couldn't leave." Monroe stopped. "Your brother?" he said. Cassandra's jaw tightened. She hadn't meant to say it. She had kept that particular piece out of the telling, not because it wasn't relevant, but because it was the piece that still had the power to break her open if she wasn't careful. And she could not afford to break open right now. "His name is Thomas," she said. "He's 19. Gerald has had him for 2 years. Not imprisoned legally. Guardianship, on the grounds that my father died in debt, and there was no adult female family member to care for him." The bitterness in her voice was thin and precise as a blade. "He's being held at Gerald's estate in Charleston. Kept comfortable. Kept quiet. Kept available as leverage." Monroe set down the brush. "You've been building toward this alone," he said. "For 2 years, looking for a way to get to the charter legally, without exposing yourself, without giving Gerald a reason to use Thomas against you." "Yes." "And then someone put you on an auction block." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who knew you were in Millhaven?" Cassandra looked at him. "That," she said, "is the question I have been asking myself since the moment Stubbs tied my wrists." Because she hadn't told anyone. She had been careful, more careful than she had ever been about anything in her life. She had moved through 3 different households in the past year, never staying long enough to leave a trace, never using her real name, never giving anyone enough to follow. She had been a ghost. And somehow, a ghost had ended up on an auction platform with Reginald Hearst in the bidding crowd. "Someone in your network," Monroe said. "Someone in whatever I thought was my network," she corrected. "Which means there's a leak I haven't found. And until I find it—" She stopped. "Until you find it, you don't know who to trust," he finished. "I know who I trust now," she said, and looked at him directly. "I'm telling you that deliberately, Mr. Monroe, because I need you to understand that I don't say it carelessly." Something moved through his expression, quick and unguarded, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. He held her gaze for a beat longer than he needed to. "I understand," he said. Then, before either of them could say anything else, the stable hand burst through the door from the yard, young, out of breath, eyes wide. "Mr. Monroe," the boy gasped. "There's a man at the front gate. Says he's carrying a letter from Mr. Hearst. Says it's—" The boy swallowed. "Says it requires immediate response. He's got 2 other men with him, sir. They're armed." The air in the stable changed in an instant. Monroe didn't move fast. He never moved fast. He simply moved with a purposefulness that made every motion count, straightening, reaching for his coat from the hook on the post. "Cassandra," he said, without looking at her. His voice had dropped, gone quieter and harder in the way it did when he was most serious. "Go inside. Stay with Mrs. Hale. Don't come to the front of the house." "What does the letter say?" "I don't know yet."
"Monroe," she stepped forward, "if that letter is what I think it is—"
"Then I need you inside," he said. And now he did look at her, direct and entirely calm. "Because if Hurst has sent men to my front gate today, it means someone told him you're here. And if he knows you're here, the last place you should be is standing in the open, where 3 armed men can see you." Cassandra stood very still for 1 second. Every instinct she had said to fight, to stand her ground, to not let another person make decisions about her safety, because every time she had trusted someone else to do that, the ground had given way beneath her. But Monroe wasn't making decisions about her safety because he thought she was incapable. He was making decisions about her safety because he was thinking 3 moves ahead. She recognized the difference. "All right," she said. She walked back toward the house, fast and close to the wall, and she did not look toward the front gate. But she heard the sound of horses beyond the fence line, and she heard Monroe's voice when he called out, steady and unhurried and absolutely without fear. "Tell them I'll be right there." And in the kitchen, Mrs. Hale was already at the window with the bolt thrown, and in her hand she was holding a small iron key on a cord. And when Cassandra came through the door, the older woman looked at her with eyes that had already moved past shock into the territory of absolute determination. "There is a room," Mrs. Hale said quietly, "beneath this house. Your mother helped me build it. She said someday someone would need it." She held up the key. She said if that day came, I would know. Outside, Cassandra could hear voices at the front gate. Monroe's, and then another, harder and louder, and carrying the particular confidence of a man who had come with numbers and a plan. Reginald Hurst's man had arrived, and somewhere in the eastern fields of Harrowfield, under the white Georgia sun, the trap that had been 14 months in the making was finally, irrevocably, closing. The room beneath the house was not a room so much as a deliberate silence, a space carved out of the earth with the specific intention of swallowing sound and keeping secrets. Cassandra had been in 3 of them over the years, all built by different hands for the same essential reason, which was that the world above had a habit of becoming dangerous without warning. And the people who survived that kind of world were the ones who had thought ahead. She did not go into it. Mrs. Hale stared at her. "Cassandra, I heard what Monroe said." She moved to the side of the window, the same angle Mrs. Hale had shown her earlier, and looked out toward the front of the house. "He told me to stay inside. He didn't say anything about hiding. The distinction may matter less than you think if Hurst's men come through that door." "They won't come through that door." She could see the front gate from this angle, Monroe standing just inside it, unhurried as ever, and beyond the fence 3 horses and 3 men, the one in front doing the talking. "Not yet. Not while Monroe is standing there in broad daylight with the whole road watching." She paused. "What does the letter say?" "I don't know. I haven't seen it." "Has anyone gone for the solicitor in Savannah?" "Not since Monroe went himself last week." Cassandra turned from the window. "Is there anyone on this property I can send?" Mrs. Hale blinked. Then the older woman's expression shifted, away from the protective fear toward something more useful. "Young Daniel, the stable hand. He's fast, and he knows the Savannah road. Get him. Tell him to ride now,
Not this afternoon, not after supper. Now.
Cassandra was already moving toward the desk in the small room off the hall, Monroe's study.
I need paper,
She wrote fast, the kind of fast that came from years of writing quickly and accurately under pressure, while Mrs. Hale's footsteps disappeared toward the back of the house. She set out 3 things in the letter: the false survey, the Cobb connection, and a single sentence at the end that she chose carefully. The Voss Charter is the underlying issue. Your client needs to understand that before he walks into that hearing. She folded it, sealed it with wax from the desk, and handed it to Mrs. Hale when the older woman reappeared with Daniel behind her, red-faced and slightly out of breath from being found quickly. Harlan Webb, Cassandra told the boy directly, pressing the letter into his hand. Monroe's solicitor in Savannah. Do you know who that is? Yes, ma'am. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone on the road. If anyone asks you where you're going, you're delivering a supply order to the mill. She held the boy's eyes. Can you do that? Daniel was maybe 16, with a gap between his front teeth and the particular gravity of a young person who understood they'd just been handed something important. Yes, ma'am, he said again, and this time it carried weight. Go. He went. Mrs. Hale looked at Cassandra. Monroe doesn't know you just sent his solicitor a letter. Monroe is standing at his front gate talking to armed men, Cassandra said. He can be annoyed with me later. The man at the gate was named Carver, and he had the smooth, well-dressed look of someone who worked for money rather than conviction, which in Monroe's experience made him simultaneously easier to deal with and harder to trust. Mr. Hurst sends his regards, Carver said, holding out the letter. Monroe took it. He didn't open it. Mr. Hurst could have sent his regards in person, Monroe said pleasantly. Mr. Hurst is a busy man. He is. Monroe turned the letter over in his hand. He's been very busy lately. Surveys, land office filings, correspondence with registrars. He looked up at Carver with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely intentional. Tell Mr. Hurst that I received his letter, and I'll respond through proper channels. Carver's pleasant expression didn't waver, but something behind it did. Mr. Hurst was hoping for a more immediate response, sir. I'm sure he was. Monroe tucked the letter inside his coat without opening it. Good day, Mr. Carver. He turned and walked back toward the house. And he didn't hurry. And he didn't look back, because hurrying or looking back would have told them something. He had learned a long time ago that information moved both directions in every exchange, and the less you gave, the more you kept. He heard the horses behind the gate eventually turn and move away down the road. He waited until he was inside and the door was closed before he opened the letter. He read it twice. Then he walked directly to the study where Cassandra was standing at the window with her arms crossed and her jaw set. You already know what it says, he said. I know what it's likely to say. She turned. Tell me. Hurst is formally requesting access to Harrowfield's eastern boundary for a survey verification, citing the pending legal challenge. Monroe set the letter on the desk. He's given me 5 days to agree, or he'll petition the court to compel access.
That's not a legal request, Cassandra said immediately. He doesn't have standing to demand survey access before the challenge hearing. His solicitor knows that. Then why send it? She looked at the letter. Because it's not really about the survey. He's testing whether you know that. If you agree, it tells him your legal representation is weak. If you refuse and don't cite the proper grounds, same conclusion. She paused. And if you respond by referencing the fraudulent alterations and the Cobb connection, it tells him you've already been doing your homework. Which I have. Which you have. But the question is, how much of that homework he already knows about? She met his eyes. I sent your solicitor a letter this morning. Monroe went still. I sent Daniel on the Savannah Road an hour ago, she said without flinching. Your solicitor needs to know about the charter before the hearing.
He also needs to know about Cobb before Hearst has time to manage that particular relationship more carefully. A beat. I understand if that oversteps, but you were at the gate, and the window for that letter was closing. Monroe looked at her for a long moment. What did the letter say exactly? He asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down, picked up his pen, and said, Sit down. We need to draft a response to Hearst. I want you to tell me the exact legal language for declining the survey access request. Cassandra sat down. Something that had been braced in her chest for the past hour carefully, quietly, relaxed. They worked until evening, and it was the kind of work that had its own particular intimacy. Not personal. Not yet. But the intimacy of two people thinking hard in the same direction, finishing each other's logic, pushing back when the other's argument had a weak point, building something together that neither of them could have built as well alone. Monroe drafted. Cassandra corrected. Monroe pushed back on 2 corrections, and she explained her reasoning on both. And on one he conceded, and on the other he held his ground, and, after thinking about it for a full 10 minutes, she conceded his. He noticed that she conceded it without resentment, which told him something. People who were performing competence didn't concede. They deflected. She simply changed her position when the argument warranted it, and moved on. By the time Mrs. Hale knocked on the study door with supper, and the information that Daniel had returned from Savannah with a response from the solicitor, faster than expected, which meant Webb had been waiting for word. The letter to Hearst was finished. The solicitor's response had been read twice, and the shape of what was coming had resolved from fog into something with edges. Monroe read the solicitor's letter aloud. Webb had received Cassandra's letter, confirmed that he understood the charter connection, and had, on his own initiative, which spoke well of him, already sent a messenger to the Carolina Land Records Office to request a copy of the Voss Charter documentation. He estimated it would arrive within 10 days. He had also, in a line near the bottom of the letter that Monroe read twice before looking up, confirmed that the land parcel Hearst had purchased 14 months ago sat entirely within the original Voss Charter territory. Entirely, which meant every transaction Hearst had conducted on that land, every agreement, every building, every access right he had sold or leased or traded, was potentially contingent on a charter claim that Gerald Voss had suppressed and that Cassandra Stone could reopen. The room was very quiet. He didn't just want the 40 acres, Monroe said. No, Cassandra said. He wanted to consolidate enough land within the charter territory that when the claim was finally resolved, in Gerald's favor, which is how Gerald intended it to go, Hearst would have enough of a foothold to become the primary developer. Gerald gets the legal victory. Hearst gets the land access. Both men get wealthy. She paused. And I disappear. Monroe set the letter down. Gerald sold you to Hearst, he said. The flatness in his voice was not dispassion. It was the kind of control that went over something much hotter. He arranged for me to be sold, she said. He couldn't do it directly. There are still people in the Carolinas who knew my mother, who would have asked questions. So the chain was long enough to look like ordinary misfortune. She said ordinary misfortune with a precision that made it clear she knew exactly how extraordinary it had been. 14 months of preparation for a sale that was supposed to take me somewhere no one would look. Hearst's household, where I would have had no ability to access legal records, no ability to communicate with anyone outside the property, and no way to reach the charter documentation, even if I'd known exactly where it was. She held his gaze, which I didn't, until today. Monroe stood up. He moved to the window, not the careful sideways angle of looking without being seen, but straight on, like a man who had decided he wasn't hiding from anything. "Your brother is in Charleston," he said. "Yes." "Gerald's estate?" "Yes." "The charter documentation, your copy of the bloodline evidence, the original deed records, whatever your family preserved before Gerald dismantled everything. Where is it?" Cassandra was silent for a moment. "I don't have it," she said. Monroe turned. "Thomas has it," she said quietly. "My mother gave it to him before she died. She didn't give it to me because she knew I was already being watched, and she knew if it was found on me, it was gone forever. She hid it with Thomas because he was 12, and no one was looking at a 12-year-old boy." The weight of that decision, her mother's impossible, precise, heartbreaking calculation, moved through her voice briefly, like a shadow through light. "He's had it for 6 years. Gerald doesn't know it exists." "But Thomas knows what it is." "Thomas knows everything." A pause. "He's the one who told me about the charter provision. He found it himself, reading through the documents, 2 years before Gerald took custody of him." Something that was not quite a smile crossed her face, thin and proud and painful. "He's 19, and he is considerably smarter than anyone who's currently holding him has thought to account for." Monroe looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a man in Charleston." Cassandra went very still. "A former business associate," Monroe continued. "Someone I trust, which is a short list, and he knows he's on it. He owes me a considerable favor that he has been waiting 2 years for me to collect." He paused. "I could send word tomorrow." "If Gerald realizes someone is moving toward Thomas—" "Gerald won't know who's moving or why. My man in Charleston is not known to anyone in Voss's circle." Monroe's voice was entirely steady. "He can get to Thomas. He can get the documents out." Cassandra stood up. The chair scraped back, and she was on her feet, and for a moment she just stood there, both hands pressed flat on the desk, and the careful stillness she kept around herself like armor cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, enough to show what was underneath, which was not weakness, but the exhaustion of a person who had been holding a wall up alone for a very long time. "If this goes wrong," she said, her voice low and precise, "Thomas is the one who pays for it. Not me, not you. Him." "I know," Monroe said. "If Hurst's men are watching this property, my man in Charleston doesn't come through this property. Gerald has connections in every county between here and Cassandra." Monroe's voice was quiet, just quiet, but it stopped her. He looked at her across the desk with an expression that was entirely direct and entirely without the performance of reassurance, because he had understood, somewhere in the past few days, that she didn't want to be reassured. She wanted to be heard accurately. "I am not telling you this will be easy or certain or without risk. I'm telling you that I can put someone I trust in motion tomorrow, and that doing nothing is also a choice, and that the hearing is in 3 weeks, and 3 weeks is not a long time when what you need is documentation that's currently sitting in Gerald Voss's house." The room was very still. Cassandra looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the water oak in Millhaven, finding something fixed in the chaos, something to hold the line of the horizon steady. "Send the letter tonight," she said. He nodded. "Tonight." He sat back down at the desk, pulled a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. She watched his hand move across the page, the same steady, deliberate movements as everything else he did. And she thought about her mother, who had spent the last years of her life making careful plans with imperfect materials and insufficient time. She thought about Thomas in a comfortable room in Charleston, with 6 years of their family's history hidden somewhere in his possession, waiting for a sister who kept not coming. She was coming now. The knock on the front door came at 9:30. Not the gate, the door, which meant whoever it was had already come through the property, which meant either they'd come over the fence in the dark or someone had let them in. Monroe was on his feet before the second knock. Mrs. Hale was already in the hallway, a lamp in her hand, her face carefully expressionless, in the particular way that meant she was actively working to keep it that way. "I know who it is," the older woman said quietly. Monroe looked at her. "I sent for him this afternoon," she said, "when I saw the men at the gate. I should have told you. I'm telling you now." "Who is it, Mrs. Hale?" The older woman looked past him to where Cassandra had appeared in the study doorway, and the look she gave Cassandra was the most complicated thing Monroe had seen in 11 years of knowing her. Apology and hope and grief and love all collapsed into a single expression that lasted only a second before she smoothed it back down. "His name is Thomas Stone," Mrs. Hale said. "He's been traveling for 4 days. He left Charleston the same morning Hurst's men showed up at this gate." She paused. "I don't believe that's a coincidence. I believe someone warned him." Cassandra made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of something breaking open that had been held shut for a very long time. She moved past Monroe, past Mrs. Hale, to the front door, and she opened it. The young man standing on the porch was 19 years old, with dark hair and tired eyes, and a leather satchel held against his chest with both arms, the way a person holds something they have been keeping safe for a very long time. He was thin and road dirty, and breathing like someone who had been afraid for days and was only now allowing himself to stop. He looked at his sister. "I brought everything," Thomas Stone said. His voice cracked on the last word. Cassandra pulled him inside, both arms around him, and held on, and the satchel pressed between them contained 6 years of silence and patience and the entire legal foundation of everything they had lost and everything they were about to fight to take back. Monroe stood in the hallway and watched, and he did not move, and he did not speak, because some moments required a witness, not a participant. Behind him, Mrs. Hale set her lamp down on the hall table and pressed her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. Outside, the Georgia night was heavy and hot and full of sound, and somewhere on the road from Charleston, the men who had been watching Thomas Stone had realized, too late, that they'd been watching an empty room. Thomas spread the documents across Monroe's desk, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head for a long time, and was determined not to rush it now that it had finally arrived. There were 11 of them. Some were old enough that the paper had gone soft at the folds, the ink faded to brown. Others were newer, copies made in Thomas's own hand, precise and clean, with annotations in the margins that showed he had not merely kept these documents, but studied them. Cassandra stood at one side of the desk. Monroe stood at the other. Neither of them spoke while Thomas laid each paper down and named it. Original Charter Grant, dated 1749, with the bloodline provision in Article 7. Thomas pointed without touching. Copy of my grandfather's will, with the inheritance designation. 3 sworn affidavits from witnesses to the original boundary survey. These are the ones Mother tracked down before she got sick. I don't know how she found the men, but she did. He moved to the next. Gerald's legal challenge to the inheritance, filed in 1802, and the court's ruling. His voice stayed flat on that one. The flatness of someone who had read a document enough times that the emotion had been worn down to something harder and more durable. And this. He set down the last paper separately, slightly apart from the others. "What is it?" Monroe asked. "A letter," Thomas said. "From Gerald to a man named Aldous Perch, dated 8 months ago. Perch is a land broker in Augusta." He looked at Monroe steadily. "Gerald lays out the entire arrangement. Hearst's role, the false survey, the plan to use the indentured sale to remove Cassandra from the legal picture. He names Cobb at the land office. He specifies the amount paid to your previous house manager to leave and take certain documents with him." A pause. "He was keeping it as insurance against Hearst, in case Hearst decided the arrangement was more valuable without Gerald in it." Monroe picked up the letter. He read it. He set it down. "How did you get this?" he asked. Thomas looked at his sister briefly, then back. "Gerald keeps a study on the second floor of his estate. He locks it. He doesn't know I had a copy of the key made 14 months ago, because he doesn't consider me a threat." Something moved through the boy's eyes. Not bitterness exactly, but the particular clarity of someone who had spent 2 years being underestimated and had used every second of it. He should have. Cassandra pressed her hand flat on the letter without picking it up. She stood there with her palm against Gerald's handwriting, against her uncle's neat, assured, devastating script. And she breathed once, slow and deliberate. "This ends it," she said quietly. "This ends his legal defense," Monroe said carefully. "It doesn't end Gerald himself." "It ends his claim," Thomas said. "That's what matters legally. With this letter, the charter provision, and the mark, the court can't rule in Gerald's favor without ruling that his own documented fraud is legitimate. No judge in Georgia takes that position publicly." He looked at Monroe. "Is your solicitor good?" "He's very good." "Then yes," Thomas said. "It ends it." Monroe sent a rider to Savannah before dawn. Not Daniel this time. One of his own men, someone he'd trusted for years, with a locked box and a letter and instructions to place both directly into Harlan Webb's hands, and no one else's. He stood in the yard and watched the rider go, and then he stood there for another minute after the sound of hooves had faded, just thinking. Mrs. Hale found him there. "You're calculating," she said. "I'm always calculating." "You're calculating something different than usual." She stood beside him, not looking at him, looking at the road the way he'd been looking at it. "She's going to be all right, Jonathan." He glanced at her. She almost never used his given name. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He was quiet for a moment. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. Webb needs time to prepare the charter claim as a counterfiling. Gerald will receive notice, and he will move. He'll try to discredit the documents. He'll try to find Cassandra before the hearing date. He'll try to find out where Thomas is." He paused. 3 weeks is not a lot of buffer. "No," Mrs. Hale agreed. "It isn't." A beat. "That's what you're calculating?" He didn't answer. Mrs. Hale nodded slowly, as though he had. "She doesn't need protecting, Jonathan. She needs standing beside." "I know the difference," he said quietly. "Make sure she knows you know it," Mrs. Hale said, and went back inside. The first move came 2 days later, and it came from a direction none of them had fully prepared for. Webb's reply arrived by mid-morning, fast, which meant the man had been working through the night, and the news was partly good and partly not. The charter documentation was legitimate. The bloodline provision was legally intact, and Webb was confident about the counterfiling. The not good part was 4 lines near the bottom of the letter, written with the compressed urgency of a solicitor who chose his words carefully and was currently choosing them very carefully indeed. Gerald Voss arrived in Savannah yesterday evening. He has retained local counsel and is seeking an emergency injunction to compel the surrender of all Voss family documents currently held by private parties. He is also filing a petition to have Cassandra Stone remanded to his legal custody as a ward of court, on the grounds that her father's debt and her minor status at the time of his death created a guardianship obligation that was never legally dissolved. Monroe read that paragraph twice. Then he read it to Cassandra. The color didn't leave her face. She was too controlled for that. But her jaw tightened, and her hands, which had been still, closed into fists at her sides before she made them open again. "I'm 22, she said. "The guardianship argument is worthless." "It's worthless if the judge is honest," Monroe said. "It buys Gerald time and legal noise if the judge isn't." "Is Cobb the registrar for the Savannah court?" "No, different jurisdiction." "Then Gerald doesn't have the judge pre-managed." She thought fast, visibly, the way she always thought. Not scattered, but sequential, each piece following the last. The injunction to compel surrender of documents is more dangerous than the guardianship petition. If he gets a court order, he can demand the charter documentation before the hearing. If he gets the documentation before the hearing, it disappears. Webb anticipated that, Monroe said, pointing to the next paragraph. She read it herself this time. Webb had already moved the copies to a second location and retained a witness to their contents. He was filing a protective order on the documents that morning, citing the documented evidence of fraud in Gerald's letter to Perch. "He used the letter," Cassandra said. "He used the letter." She set the paper down. Then she looked at Monroe with an expression that was very direct and slightly unguarded and said, "Gerald is in Savannah, which means he's not in Charleston." Monroe held her gaze. "Which means his estate is short one person watching it." "The documents Thomas brought are copies," she said carefully. "The originals are still in Gerald's study. If we had the originals..." "The copies are sufficient," Webb says. "The copies are sufficient to win the case," she said. "The originals are sufficient to bury Gerald so completely that he can never reconstruct this argument in any court, in any state, for the rest of his life." She paused. "There's a difference between winning the case and making sure this never happens again." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll write to my man in Charleston today." Thomas was the one who argued against it. Not against the plan itself. He'd thought of it himself 2 years ago and had been waiting for the right moment. But against who went with Monroe's contact to retrieve the originals. "No one knows that study the way I do," Thomas said. "You just left Charleston 4 days ago," Cassandra said. "If Gerald has men watching, Gerald is in Savannah managing an emergency legal filing. His men in Charleston are watching an empty room, which means they've either been recalled to Savannah or they're confused and waiting for instructions." Thomas looked at his sister with the particular patience of a younger sibling who has spent years being protected from things he could handle. "I know the house, Cass. I know where the key is. I know where the backup copies are kept, and I know which drawer has a false bottom." He paused. "Your man doesn't know any of that." Cassandra stared at her brother. Thomas stared back. "He's right," Mrs. Hale said from the doorway, and both of them looked at her. The older woman's expression was apologetic but firm. "I hate that he's right, but he is." Monroe said nothing. He had understood within the first 30 seconds that this was not his argument to make, and he was smart enough to stay out of it. Cassandra looked at her brother for a long moment. At the 19-year-old who had spent 2 years in a comfortable cage, reading documents and making key copies and waiting. at the person who was the only family she had left, and who had somehow, impossibly, managed to hold himself together through all of it. "You come back," she said. Her voice was very low. "I always come back," Thomas said. "I mean it, Thomas." "So do I." He left with Monroe's man the following morning before the house was fully awake, and Cassandra stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of 2 horses going down the road, and did not allow herself to watch them go, because she knew if she watched, she would call him back. And calling him back was the wrong decision. And she had made enough right decisions in enough terrible situations to know that the right decision was sometimes the one that felt like it was breaking you. Mrs. Hale put a cup of coffee on the table in front of her without saying anything. Cassandra picked it up and drank it, and did not break. The next 11 days were the longest of her life, and her life had contained some very long stretches of time. Webb filed the counterclaim on day 3. Gerald's injunction was denied on day 5. The protective order on the documents held, and the judge, who turned out to be a man of considerably more integrity than Gerald had apparently anticipated, noted in his ruling that the petitioner had failed to demonstrate any legitimate legal basis for the seizure request. Gerald's guardianship petition was dismissed the same day, on the grounds that Cassandra Stone was a legal adult and had been for 4 years. Monroe read both rulings to her in the study, and when he finished, she sat very still for a moment, and then said, "He's going to escalate." "Yes," Monroe said. "He has nothing left to lose on the legal side, which means he'll move outside it." "Yes." She looked at him. "Are you afraid?" "No." He said it simply, the way he said most things. "Are you?" She thought about it genuinely, which was something she hadn't let herself do in a long time. Actually answer the question, instead of managing it. "I've been afraid for 8 years, she said. "I think I've gotten to the point where afraid is just weather. It doesn't stop me from moving." Monroe looked at her with that expression, the one that was not quite readable, the one that happened when she said something he hadn't expected, and he was deciding what to do with it. This time, though, something in it had shifted from what it had been in those first days. Less calculation, more recognition. "Cassandra," he said. "Don't," she said quietly, not harshly, just gently, firmly, like setting something down carefully rather than dropping it. "Not until this is finished." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Then let's finish it." Thomas came back on day 9 with a leather portfolio that was older than either of them, the corners worn soft with handling, the initials EV pressed into the front cover in letters that had almost faded to nothing. Eleanor Voss, their mother. He set it on the desk in Monroe's study, and Cassandra opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. And inside were the originals. Every document, every deed, every piece of their family's history that Gerald had spent 12 years trying to erase, along with 3 additional papers that Thomas had found in the false bottom drawer and that none of them had known existed. The first was a second letter from Gerald to Perch, more recent than the one Thomas had copied, in which Gerald explicitly confirmed that he had arranged for Cassandra's indentured sale to Hearst's household through a chain of intermediaries. In his own handwriting, signed. The second was a record of payment to Stubbs, the auctioneer in Millhaven, signed by a man whose name meant nothing to Cassandra, but whose address placed him firmly in Gerald's household. The third was a letter to Gerald from someone whose name Cassandra did recognize, a judge in Augusta, suggesting that Gerald's arrangement had not been entirely legal, even by the loose standards of the time, and that the judge in question was withdrawing his informal support for the scheme, effective immediately. Someone had gotten nervous. Someone had put it in writing, and Gerald, with the arrogance of a man who had always won, had kept it. Thomas sat down in the chair by the door, road dirty and visibly exhausted, and watched his sister read through every document twice. He watched Monroe read them after her. He watched the two of them look at each other across the desk. "Webb presents this Monday," Monroe said. It was Friday.
"Webb presents this Monday," Cassandra confirmed.
"Gerald will know the originals are gone within days."
"He'll know before that," Thomas said from the chair. "The household staff knew me. Someone will notice the study was accessed." He paused. "He'll move before the hearing if he thinks he still has something to move with." "He doesn't," Cassandra said. "He might not know that yet." She looked at her brother, then at Monroe. Then she made a decision that had been building for 11 days, quietly and inevitably, the way significant decisions always built. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of smaller moments until the weight of them left only one possible direction. "I want to be at the hearing," she said. Monroe didn't hesitate. "All right."
"Gerald will be there."
"I know."
"I want to face him directly. I don't want to be the name on a filing. I want to stand in that room."
Monroe looked at her steadily. "Then you'll stand in that room."
The hearing was held on a Monday morning in late August, in a courthouse in Savannah where the heat was sufficient to make the air itself feel like an argument. Gerald Voss was already seated when Cassandra walked in, and she watched the moment he saw her, watched the shock move through him and harden into fury, and then, as his eyes moved from her face to the portfolio in Webb's hands, to Monroe standing beside her, transmute into something colder and more calculating. He had not expected her to be there. He had not expected any of this. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned her attention to the judge, because Gerald Voss was not worth more than 3 seconds of her attention, and she was done giving him more than he deserved. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Webb presented the charter. He presented the bloodline provision and its description of the mark, and Cassandra confirmed it before the court with a composure that the court recorder later told someone had been one of the most remarkable things he'd witnessed in 20 years of proceedings. Webb presented the false survey, the Cobb connection, both of Gerald's letters to Perch, the payment record to Stubbs, and the nervous judge's withdrawal letter. Gerald's new solicitor, the Savannah man, experienced and expensive, fought back on 3 points and lost all 3. The falsification evidence was too complete. The letters were too specific. The charter provision was too clearly intact. Gerald himself said nothing throughout the proceeding. He sat at his table with his hands folded and his face controlled and his eyes moving between Cassandra and the documents, with the expression of a man counting the exits and finding none of them viable. When the judge ruled, he ruled completely. The Voss Charter was legally recognized. The bloodline claim was confirmed. The false survey was voided, and Hearst's challenge to Harrowfield's boundary was dismissed with prejudice. Gerald Voss was referred to the state attorney on 2 counts of documented fraud, 1 count of illegal arrangement of indentured service, and a 3rd count related to the Augusta judge's letter that the court would not specify publicly, but that carried the kind of weight that follows a man for the rest of his life. Hearst, who had not appeared at the hearing, had apparently made certain financial arrangements with his solicitor the previous Friday, and was reportedly no longer in Georgia. When the judge's gavel came down, the room filled with the particular noise of a proceeding that had reached a definitive conclusion. The sound of papers being gathered and chairs being pushed back, and voices that had been carefully controlled, relaxing all at once. Thomas grabbed Cassandra's hand under the table. She squeezed back once, hard, and let go. She didn't trust herself to look at him yet. She looked straight ahead, at the seal on the wall above the judge's seat, and she breathed. Monroe was standing behind her, She didn't look at him either, but she felt him there, solid and present and unhurried, the same way she'd felt him every day for the past 3 weeks, as something dependable in the architecture of a situation that had everything else in motion. When she was steady enough, she stood. Gerald was being spoken to by 2 men in official capacity near the side door, and he looked up as Cassandra passed, and they looked at each other for the last time. She had spent 8 years building something to say to him in this moment. Not a speech, not a condemnation, just the right words in the right order. In the end, she said nothing. She looked at him with her chin level and her jaw calm, and she walked past. Some things didn't need words. Some things were said completely by the simple act of still being standing. In the corridor outside, Thomas said, "What do we do now?" It was such an honest question, asked with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had been waiting for it to be answerable for a very long time, that Cassandra almost laughed. Almost. "The charter territory needs proper legal management," she said. "The land rights need to be formally re-registered. Gerald's transactions within the territory need to be reviewed, and several of them will need to be undone." She looked at her brother. "You know this material better than anyone alive. You've been studying it for 6 years. Thomas looked at her. "I was studying it so we could fight for it." "I know," she said. "Now you get to build it." He stared at her for a moment. Then something in him, some last remnant of the vigilance he'd been carrying since he was 13 years old, finally, visibly, let go. His shoulders dropped. His face opened. He looked for the first time in years, like the 19-year-old that he actually was. "All right," he said. "Yeah, all right." Cassandra turned. Monroe was standing a few feet away, giving them the space he always gave without being asked to give it. His coat folded over his arm against the heat, watching her with that expression she'd stopped trying to classify and started simply accepting for what it was. "Your 40 acres are secure," she said. "Our case was considerably larger than 40 acres, he said. "Your solicitor is exceptional." He had exceptional material to work with. He looked at her steadily. "You did that, Cassandra. All of it. Every document, every argument, every decision about what to move and when. Webb built the legal structure. You built everything under it." She held his gaze. "I had help," she said. "For the first time in 8 years, I had help." The thing that had been building between them for 3 weeks, through documents and correspondence, and late evenings in the study, and the quiet, unperformed recognition of 2 people seeing each other clearly, settled, in that corridor, into something patient and solid, and very much there. He offered his hand. Not a formal gesture, not a transaction. Just a hand, offered plainly, the way he did everything. She took it. Outside, the city of Savannah moved through its hot August morning, entirely indifferent to what had just been decided inside its courthouse. But in the larger, slower accounting of things, the world had shifted. The Stone family's name was back on paper. The charter was restored. Thomas was free. And Cassandra Stone, who had stood on an auction block 6 weeks ago, with her wrists tied and her eyes fixed on a water oak in the middle distance, was standing in a sunlit corridor, holding the hand of a man who had paid $15 for her, not knowing she was worth everything, and who, in the end, had turned out to be worth something considerable himself. She had come to Millhaven with nothing and no one, and she was leaving Georgia with her brother beside her family's name restored, and a future that was, for the first time in 8 years, entirely her own to shape. Cassandra Stone had not been sold into silence. She had been returned at last to herself, and no one, ever again, would put a price on that.